morning, everyone. Ooh, yeah, this is working. Okay, cool. Thanks for coming out this morning. Welcome to the COP28 Symposium. I'm glad you're all here. Yeah! Love the energy. So my name's Kaylee McCarty, and I'm the new Assistant Director of Programs with the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society. I started 3 weeks ago, actually, and on my first and second day here, I got to sit in on planning meetings for this event, and it was a really nice way to kick off my time here. It was great to meet our wonderful delegates, who you'll all be meeting soon, and get to know what we're going to do for the event. So great to see you all, and with that, I will hand it off to Praveen Kumar, who is a professor in the School of Social Work, and he also is very involved in our Schiller activities. He's a current recipient of the Cyritra, am I saying that right? I don't know our grant, a Schiller-funded grant, and was one of our delegates. So thanks for speaking this morning, Praveen.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I'm not confused where should I put my that's a problem. I'm very caffeinated now. Great. Hello, everyone. As Kaylee already mentioned, I'm Praveen Kumar. I'm an associate professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. My areas of work are at the intersections of climate change, environmental justice, and global health. Most of my work is essentially focused internationally, so I do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So last year, November, December, I had the opportunity to co-lead the Boston College COP delegation, along with my colleague, Dr. Maria Pinores-Sillano-Malfrey, who is also an associate professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. And there were as many as 20 in total Boston College delegates who represented BC as observers to the COP conference. So I welcome you all for this COP28 debriefing event. And in the next few hours, there will be student-led panel, because that's something that we are going to do now. And then there's also a few exhibits that we have. Here we have health exhibit, just transitions, then a language exhibit, and a really interesting textile exhibit over here. So this is our effort to kind of really demonstrate and showcase our insights from COP28 and what were the key negotiations, terminological tangles, key areas of commitments that occurred in the last year's COP28 in Dubai. And let me tell you that these 4 exhibits are just one of several hundreds of activities, negotiations, engagements that were happening at COP28 in Dubai. In addition to that, we will close with a faculty-led panel, I think at around 2 p.m. And in that panel, we will have a conversation on basically the key issues that COP28 focused on, the key commitments, agreements that came up with, and then we will also foreshadow the COP29 key events that's going to happen in Baku, Azerbaijan this year in November and December. So here's the point. I mentioned COP a few times. So I quickly want to really share a bit of a background of what climate change COP conferences are. I assume, and I know that almost all of you would really agree that climate change is real, it is detrimentally impacting humanity, it is pernicious to a whole lot of dimensions when it comes to our Mother Earth. But here is something that I want to mention. I want to really share and talk about how really United Nations came into this entire discussion on COP. I want to also discuss what COP really stands for and so on and so forth. So since I mentioned COP a few times, so let me start with the full form of COP. So COP stands for Conference of Parties. And the Conference of Parties that was essentially conceived by one of the UN agencies, UNFCCC. Now, it's a heavy acronym, and it actually stands for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And trust me, I just gathered my mind right before this panel. Sometimes I forget what's the full form of UNFCCC as well. But the UNFCCC was convened sometimes in the 90s in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. And the first COP conference was held in Berlin, in Germany, in 1995. So that was COP 1. And that was the first conference when UN actively organized a meet, and it was attended by around 4,300 delegates. And it was the first systematic effort by the United Nations to talk, to engage with world leaders, with multilateral and bilateral institutions such as World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth, to really talk about climate change, climate action, environmental justice, and associated issues. And then it was decided that every year there will be subsequent discussions, subsequent conference that will essentially talk about how to really engage collectively around climate action. So needless to say that when we talk about COP28, which was last year, there have been 28 such COP conferences that have already occurred. Now, one of the nodal COP conference that you would have heard in the last few years would be Paris Climate Agreement, right? So Paris Agreement actually emanated from one of the COP conferences, which was COP21, which was held in Paris. And that's why it's called Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement 2015. You would have heard about Paris Agreement simply because it was a landmark agreement. There were a whole lot of treaties and negotiations that came out of it, and also because the year when Donald Trump was elected president, there were news that he extricated US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and then when the current president came in, then United States again re-entered the Paris Agreement, and that's why it also gains a whole lot of traction. Then let me also underscore that the COP conferences are very unlike the usual scientific conferences that you may have attended. So you will find open demonstrations happening, then you will have closed-door negotiations. There will be hundreds and hundreds of pavilions in COP conferences. There will be a health pavilion organized by World Health Organization. Then there will be energy pavilion by the UN Energy Agency or International Energy Agency. Then you have country-led panels. For example, you have a US pavilion by the US government, French pavilion, Indian pavilion, a large Chinese contingent, and so on and so forth. The sheer size of COP conference really shows that it is one of the nodal conferences on climate change. So, for example, the last year Dubai COP conference was essentially attended by as many as 97,000 delegates in person over the matter of 2 weeks. So, you see, and of course, needless to say that UAE had the largest delegation, followed by Brazil and some other countries. So now you can totally imagine. And just to give you a context, the COP1, which happened in Germany, we only had 4,000 delegates. So from 4,000, in a matter of 28 years, you have 97,000 in person, and then you can add around 30,000 who also attended online. So you see the massive size. And by the way, this number of 97,000 is almost double or triple than the 2022 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So you see the number that it is actually kind of adding up. Now, let me come to the utility of Boston College to be attending such conferences, and then I think we will actually transition to our conversations with our amazing students. So, as observers, the Boston College delegates, just like several thousands others over there, have this wonderful opportunity to engage, to speak, and to really attend some key negotiations, like some open discussions that happened. They also experienced some inside stories of how conflict management and negotiations happen. For example, the week 1 delegates attended, the Boston College actually had a pavilion and a side event for week 1, so they were pretty much engaged in that. They had an opportunity to engage with faith-based conversations on climate change. Then week 2, which I was leading, we had the opportunity to meet with Catherine Goldberg, who actually happened to be a Boston College alum, and she is one of the nodal member of the U.S. Just Transitions negotiation. So she was there, and then we also met with the Irish delegation, including Sinead Walsh, who was the lead of the Irish delegation, and she also spent some time. And we had very interesting conversations on how European Union are really leading the work on climate negotiations. So these are the kinds of experiences that we have. Informally, I would say that it, to a great extent, also cultivates some lasting connections, not only with faculties, but also students as well. They engage, they discuss, and also to a great extent shape their mental models towards climate and climate change. This entire discussion on the experience of the students would be incomplete if I do not really turn to my students, and then they will actually share their experiences and their engagements at COP28. So by this, I'm going to pivot to what we call as a student-led panel. So what I think I'm going to do is that first I will let's have this opportunity to have these four amazing students to introduce themselves, and then I have a few questions that I'm going to moderate with, and then hopefully the last 10 to 15 minutes we'll have time for the audience to pose questions. So how about we start with you, Jack?
Hi everybody, my name is Jack Strang. I'm a junior here, environmental studies major. I'll actually be attending BC Law next year, where I hope to pursue a JD with environmental law as a focus. And I'm just super happy to be here today. I'm originally from Oregon, so the environment has always been something that I'm really passionate about. And yeah, I can't wait for this discussion.
And Jack, you attended the week one.
I attended the week one delegation.
Thanks. I'm Gabby. I'm a senior. I'm a poli-sci and environmental studies major. So I'm graduating this May, and I plan to work for an environmental nonprofit after graduation. I'm from Austin, Texas, so also really interested in climate change, having felt the impacts of extreme heat and weather events throughout my entire life. So that really informs my perspective coming into environmental studies as a discipline. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I was also a week one delegate, so I can definitely speak to that.
Hi everyone, I'm Sancia. I'm a junior. I'm majoring in biology with a minor in medical humanities. I'm on the pre-med track. So I grew up in New Delhi, India, a city that has been facing rising pollution levels, and I think that really shaped my interest in climate and health, and I really want to take it forward through medical practice. So that's where my interest lies.
Hey y'all, my name is Eddie Ward. I'm from New York originally. I'm a dual degree JD candidate at BC Law and also an MA candidate in Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts. I'm an instructor in law with faculty status as part of the Environmental Law Teaching Program, and I was part of the Week 2 delegation.
Great, thanks so much. So there are a few questions that I have actually I'm curious to have some specific questions to be answered from each of you. But here's a question that I have in general, and any one of you can actually start. I know that there are quite a few students over here, so one general question that I have is that how can students apply to participate in the future COP conference? And any one of you can actually take, because you all really went through the experience of application and so on. So just in brief, if you can just kind of let us know what's the process. Sure.
So I think the primary application for the COP process opens up, I think, end of April, and I think it's due sometime around May 20th, usually right before, right towards the beginning of summer break. The primary application usually just consists of a series of basic questions about where your academic and extracurricular interests lie, what your involvements on campus are. After the primary application, you have the secondary application if you move forward with the process. And so the secondary application kind of comprises of a more detailed questionnaire. I think that was like more 100, 150 word responses, where you actually get to share your perspective. And I think this is due sometime in June. And then after that, I think you have, once you move forward with that, part of the secondary application is also you submit your passport details. Usually BC doesn't find out about how many delegate passes they're actually going to get for the year till sometime in August. So they tend to pick applicants and select the delegation according to that. But that's kind of the brief overview of what the application process looks like.
Thanks, Sancia.
Oh yeah, I also just wanted to add that once you're accepted into the delegation, then you participate in a fall 1-credit pass-fail course, which is just a general overview of UN politics and COP mechanisms, so you're prepared before you go into the conference.
Piggybacking on your point, Gabby, could you talk more about the 1-credit course that you took and how that really prepared for your COP attendance?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that.
And you can be candid because I know I taught that course.
So it's definitely at first a general overview of like what COP is, and also a lot of climate science, so that you know what you're talking about and you have the combination of both the science and the policy. And then we have specific themes that we focus on throughout the entire semester, and we had really awesome guest lecturers come in and talk about their specific area of expertise. So we got really amazing perspective on specific themes that we're then going to learn more about during the thematic days throughout the week 1 delegation. I don't know, does anybody else want to speak to this? Yeah.
So here's something in terms of both the point in terms of application and also the classes, just for the students over here if they're planning to apply for this year. The class is designed in a way that it prepares you for the COP engagement, really, the COP conference. And although the application may really look like in stages, at the end of the day, the application overall is to basically you have to find yourself and write in the application your interest. That's how the application is designed. Briefly to mention that, there's this one key question that I always thought about, particularly in terms of students and your attendance during the COP. What does a day really look like as a delegate in COP?
So I think that in general it really varies based on where the COP is being hosted. So I can only speak to our experience, obviously, in Dubai. But the general day in the life was you wake up pretty early, usually around 7 a.m., and then you have breakfast as a delegation. You kind of informally meet then and try to plan out your day. So figure out what events are you going to try to attend, what exhibits and pavilions you want to go to. And then you get on the bus that takes you to the conference, which in Dubai was essentially a mini city. There's 100,000 people there about, and then you spend the majority of the day just going from meeting to meeting, and maybe in the middle if you have a break, then you can go to the pavilion. And it's really just guided based on what you're interested in. Some people try to track a specific document, so specific negotiations as they unfold. The way that I went about it was I just tried to really get an overall sense of all the different things going on. So I'd go to a pavilion with NASA, and then I would go to a high-level meeting with the president of Botswana, and then go to negotiations. So I think that it can really vary, but it's very, very, very packed days, and you leave every single day feeling very fulfilled in terms of how much you learned, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so everything Jack said is absolutely correct. But to get a little more detailed on what those meetings can look like, I personally, I divided the meetings in my head into 3 separate things you could do. You could learn, you could share, or you could track. So for tracking meetings, these are UN meetings where you're looking at what does the draft text look like, what's going on, what are the agreements that countries are holding back on, that's moving forward. I find that from my experience in week 2, these meetings were not particularly useful for me in terms of learning what's going on, because they're very high level, a little esoteric. And so I found myself mostly in meetings that were more learning and sharing. So learning meetings, these were hosted by host countries, they were at pavilions, or they were hosted by the UN. So it was how can we increase women's empowerment in renewable energy in Africa, or there were sharing meetings too, where we could be in roundtables and groups, with the delegation from Estonia, and getting to help craft what their youth demands were, Or I found a random meeting with the Undersecretary of Commerce for the US about how to decarbonize building materials. So it's kind of a choose your own adventure at COP. You can't do everything. There are just so many things to do. So you've got different apps open and websites and PDFs, and you just kind of pick like what seems interesting and try it out. And you can't be in two places at once. So for some things I wanted to go, I'd say, can you take notes or photos for me? Because I'm still interested. So you'll never be bored if you go to COP.
That's such a good point.
Just to add a plug, we all did like day in the life takeovers at COP that are still in the Schiller Instagram highlights. So if you guys really want like a more in-depth thing on what our day in the life looked like, they're still there. And we did try to make them like at least a little bit entertaining. So go watch.
Gabby, do you want to add?
Oh, no. You guys covered it.
So there's one key point, I think, Eddie, you mentioned about law, right? So, and you are a law student. So there's this one specific question that I had in mind, and if you could respond briefly, is that how does really international law really pan out in these conferences? What has been your experience, your discussion with so many leading delegates, the presidents and the prime ministers and then undersecretaries and so on? So how does really law and international law play out in these conferences? Did you have that kind of a discussion or engagement? And if you could enlighten us.
Yeah, absolutely. So international law is one of the more complex types of law. It's a class you can take in law school, and I took the class, and I'm still confused about it because, there is no, like, when we're looking at a national level, like law is very easy to figure out what it is. Like it's written down or it's what a court says, but on the international stage, there is no world court. There's the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, but of course they have limitations. And international law is really what every country agrees it is, which is kind of confusing and hard to wrap your head around if you, like me, want just a judge to say that's what the law is. And so there have been really successful international laws in the past in the forms of treaties that get international buy-in and are binding. And I think about the Montreal Protocol, which is many scholars consider the most effective treaty in world history that saved the ozone layer and phased out chlorofluorocarbons around the world. But the Paris Agreement is not like that. It's not a binding international treaty like the Montreal Protocol. And for me, like coming into law school, my question was always why? Why can't we just make it binding? Why can't we say you have to reduce your emissions or else you're going to get penalized? But like no country there would be no buy-in for that, unfortunately. And so the Paris Agreement, it's not binding. It is very much a voluntary agreement, but it's also effective. There have been a lot of other international treaties recently based on this idea, because you can get such great buy-in that you wouldn't get in any other situation. There's currently a draft for global plastics treaty that's going to be based on the Paris Agreement. And so it means that every COP, there's going to be incremental progress, right? If you're hoping that we're going to solve climate change with some agreement, it's not going to happen. Every year we have to push countries a little bit because that's unfortunately the best we can do. And COP28 was a success in that sense. We got fossil fuels in an agreement for the first time. Speaking with delegates from the US and the EU, they wanted more, obviously. They wanted a 2035 phase down, and we didn't get that. But fossil fuels was mentioned, and that's an improvement. So for those who are hoping for like a binding law that solves all the problems, the Paris Agreement is not it. But if you're willing to understand that incremental progress is the best we can get on a planet with 8 billion people, then I'm pretty happy with the progress we've made.
Thanks, Eddie. And I would quickly underscore what Eddie just mentioned in terms of connecting the courses that Eddie has taken over here in BC and then his exposure and experience at COP. So these are the kinds of experiences that at least as Boston College faculty, I would really want to render to my students, And that I feel is one of the critical contributions of sending BC delegates and BC students to COP. It is like, the way I put it is that gone are the days where, we would fulfill the needs of the students with just confinements of the classrooms. It is, I would say, that the course is taken in reality. You're basically thinking about it while you're experiencing and engaging with some of the leading delegates. And that's I think, one of the critical contributions and benefits of having the BC delegates there, and so on and so forth. I had a quick question for Gabby as well. So, Gabby, what do you think one of your favorite events that you witnessed at the last year COP?
Definitely. I think it would probably be, I don't know if it was Health or Just Transition Day, but it was delivering a gendered, responsive, just transition for all. So it was about gender, it was also about just transition, and it also brought in econ and health and lots of other components that we were talking about in these thematic days. So it was a really intersectional event, which is why I liked it so much. The setup of it was a policy solution workshop, so it was one of the UN side events. So there were representatives from all different organizations. There was like a French Minister of Labor, there was a representative from global financial institutions, there were representatives from conservation nonprofits. So you get a really diverse set of perspectives about how to approach integrating gender responsive policy into the energy transition policies. So it talked about green economy and agriculture, but also like lots of different things, and you get a really comprehensive understanding. And I have so many notes from this event. I just feel like I learned a lot, and it really helped contextualize all the other events that I was going to in the areas of health and gender and just transition. And those were the three main issues that I was following while I was at COP. So it was one of my favorite events because you kind of got to see it synthesized all into one and learn just some like groundbreaking, really creative solutions from a very diverse set of perspectives. Yeah.
That was great, Gabby. I mean, by the way, gender and the role of gender in the climate action was one of the key components of last year's COP. So thanks for really highlighting that. And what about you, Sancia? What was your memorable day at the week one that you attended?
Well, it was actually one of the first days that we were there. So this was the first COP that we actually had health as a thematic day. We had like a health day at COP. Okay, just to contextualize this, because climate change is such an intersectional issue, what the UN does is it divides like the days of the climate conference into thematic days. So you have like a day dedicated to say health, a day dedicated to gender, a day dedicated to finance, like climate finance. And it's not that these are the only topics that are discussed that day, but they are the topics of focus. So one of our first days there, we had the health day, which I thought was really interesting because I learned about things that I had never really thought of before too. Like I'd heard of, before I went to COP, I'd heard of viral infection rates increasing and antibiotic resistance, but there were things also that I had never thought of before, and we actually ended up adding it to the poster. But like, they had observed, for example, like a trend in increasing female genital mutilation rates in the Middle East with increasing climate change, and that was a health connection that I would have never thought to draw. So I would say that was probably my highlight day. But generally, I think I learned so much from the rest of the thematic days too, and it was so interesting being part of delegation where everybody had so many different interests, because I could really, count on, say, Gabby and Jack to be like, hey, you guys know probably more about this issue than I do. Are you guys attending like any really cool events on this today? And then I would go there and I learned so much more about that too. So it was just an incredible experience overall.
Thanks. And Jack, there's just a slight, I would say, pivot in terms of the statement of the question that I have for you. All of us really attended a whole lot of meetings, either collectively or some individual meetings as well. What was your memorable meeting that you attended, and if you could share those thoughts?
Yeah. So before I start, one of the things that we didn't realize at first, but then quickly realized was that at the COP, a lot of the meetings that you want to go to, you can't. They're closed to observers, so we all had observer badges. So a lot of the meetings that we wanted to go to, we weren't able to. But there are certain organizations at the COP that we were members of, and as a result, we could go to those organizations and enter a lottery to basically get a ticket to be allowed to go into one of those meetings. So one of the days that we did that, we actually won the lottery and received the ticket.
Lucky you.
Yeah, lucky us. Boston College as a delegation got one ticket, and that basically granted us access into a lot of the closed door meetings. And so we just passed that ticket around throughout the day, and each person, it's one person per ticket. So I would go into a meeting, and then I would leave, and I'd be texting Sancia, and she would grab the ticket and go into a different meeting. So that was a really cool experience. So the meeting that I got to go to that was closed to the public and closed to observers was on landlocked developing states and the unique vulnerabilities that they face. So that was hosted, as I mentioned earlier, by the President of the Republic of Botswana. I think that was a really just like awe-inspiring moment for me, because I was sitting front row in this closed door meeting, and all of a sudden this large security detail walks in, and it's the UN Secretary General, and I'm front row, I'm 20 feet away from him. And that meeting was really interesting because it wasn't really about negotiations, it was more so about spreading awareness for the unique vulnerabilities that these landlocked developing states have, and how their inability to access the sea really reduces their ability to have viability on the trade market, which then has a lot of impacts for climate change and their ability to respond to natural disasters. So I think that was definitely the most memorable moment for me.
Thanks, Jack. And just in case, so there is a whole lot of, I would say, name throwing and flaunting over here that, hey, I met with President of Botswana, or met with, Under Secretary General. I think this year or last year, a few of our BC delegates, they met with John Kerry. 2 years back in Glasgow, there were a few delegates who also met with John Kerry. And there were a few students who kind of 2 years back, they shouted to John Kerry that, hey, we are from Boston College, the same the same institution that you went to. And then John Kerry was like, good for you. So, so all of that, and so that's great. I mean, you can see a few pictures over there where you can actually see students, our students having some selfies and oh, oops, that's embarrassing. But you'll find more pictures. So you'll really find that it was quite a productive engagement, speaking with these delegates and with these leading climate leaders and so on and so forth. So that's great. You'll find pictures over here that in no way, I'm sure, that will be indicative of how exhausting, in a good way, the experience is. But Jack, you did mention about one piece which is so critical, and before I actually jump to the audience for questions, you mentioned about the challenges in terms of there are so many closed-door negotiations that occur, which are in true sense closed-door. A lot of observers, a lot of press, they are not allowed to enter because, of course, there's a whole lot of firefighting happening over there between different country leaders. So that was one of the challenges. So if any one of you would really paint a picture in terms of the challenges that you encountered during COP28.
I think one challenge that, at least for us as undergraduate students, that we definitely felt was sitting in on negotiations. A lot of the times they'd be discussing something incredibly niche, they'd be discussing Article 6, paragraph 2, subsection A or something, and then it would take us a while to so the UNFCCC's website would post the drafts that were being discussed on their website, but it took us a while to navigate that situation, figure out how to access those drafts and the recent revisions. And also a lot of these times, these discussions would be about, changing one specific word, and they'd spend 15, 20 minutes at least on a minimum discussing that. And I think because sometimes all of these things are so niche, it can become a little difficult to figure out how that specific word change is going to impact things big picture. So I think one thing that we all discussed pretty extensively throughout COP was how huge a role language played, how huge a role specific words, unabated versus abated, phase down versus phase out. I think these were the ones that we discussed probably most often, but there were a bunch of those. So I think that was really interesting. And I think we learned how to navigate those pretty well, but I would say they were challenging to navigate at the beginning.
Yeah, I guess the other challenge that I think we had at the beginning of the week is there's a lot of, really flashy events with, very high-profile individuals, and they had these in like this huge auditorium. There's lots of pictures on the slideshow, but these were the events that were drawing all of the press attention, and we're also drawing us in at first. But I think that we came to realize that a lot of times at these events, they're making announcements about all the great things that each country is doing, but you're not really getting to understand the full scale of what each country is doing, because that's just what they're reporting that they're doing. And so we started to figure out that these smaller meetings and events, and actually getting to talk with other students from across the world, that was a lot more educational and I think informative. So I think kind of like the behind the scenes is what we ended up realizing was where the true knowledge that we could gain was. That took a few days because obviously they were very like attention grabbing events, and so we were drawn to them at first, and we eventually had to step away from that a little bit.
Eddie, do you want to add on the challenges? Because I know that we had some conversations here the same week as mine. So.
Yeah, we definitely faced challenges. And one of our challenges was just figuring out where everything was, because the venue was Expo City, where the World Expo was held the year before, and it was enormous. Getting from one end to the other was a 20-minute walk in like 100-degree heat, and we're all wearing suits. So you can imagine it was, day one, I think I walked like 16 miles or something insane. It was crazy. So yeah, we faced similar things about getting into meetings that were full. I'd like to think that we learned pretty quickly that some of the smaller meetings that weren't just like all the UN plenary sessions were very valuable. But I would echo what you said about every country claiming that they are the world climate leader. Like you go to the U.S. pavilion, and if you listen to what the U.S. delegates said, the United States is the leader of the world when it comes to fighting climate change. And anyone who's familiar with American climate policy knows that that is not necessarily the case, which was kind of entertaining to me. But yeah, I really think that I appreciate what everyone in week one shared with us, because the week two folks had a little bit better, and that we sort of knew what we were up against.
That's nicely put, Eddie. And to basically summarize the challenges, for example, Sancia mentioned about the language piece, the terminological tangles, and that was so interesting. And that's why we have one of the exhibits on language that will further really provide you with just a little bit of an experience in terms of how different language and terms are so crucial and important in the UN system and in these conferences. And then Jack was talking really about cutting through those flashy pavilions and really trying to find the meaning. And then Eddie, to a great extent, underscored the vast expanse of the conference and of course the miles that you had to walk. That's the number of miles that I walk in an entire year. However, I mean, I think that's a right time and occasion to actually move to the audience, and would really like to solicit questions from the audience. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and if you could keep your question within 1 minute, that would be great. Anyone? Yes.
I was wondering if you guys could talk about your interactions with other students and what it was like being like some of the youngest delegates at the conference.
I can respond to that. I actually would say that you were on the older side for the youth delegates. There were a number of separate youth delegations that we had the opportunity to join, such as like Ringo or Youngo, which are both research and youth official UN recognized delegations. And one of the leaders for the Youngo meetings, which are like morning and afternoon debriefs for everybody to get together, one of the leaders was like 16 years old, and it was like her second COP. So it was actually really, really exciting to get to engage with other youth activists and organizers and attendees, and realize just how committed some of these younger folks are as well. So that was actually something that was really surprising to me, getting to be involved in those morning and afternoon debriefs for each thematic day with the youth delegations is that there are so many young people there who are like so excited and so passionate, and people who are younger than me who already know way more and are sharing so much fascinating knowledge and helping me navigate the COP. So it was definitely interesting to be university students and engaging with the representatives who are leading the meetings after. It was always really exciting to talk to them and be able to like exchange information, and they would, you know, offer to answer any questions. But I would say that the youth presence was very, very powerful and strong, and I was actually really surprised about how I felt like on the older end in some cases of the youth representatives. I don't know.
I agree with what you said, and it was really amazing getting to meet people from like all over the world. Like I made connections with people I still keep in touch with, from Estonia to Ethiopia, which was really cool. And also we kind of have a benefit being from the United States, because Boston College, we're only observers. We're not technically on any country's delegation, but most countries have an official youth delegation. So that's like youth who are like represent the country. The U.S. doesn't do that because. For the U.S. delegation, everyone on the team has to work for the federal government, and there aren't many youths or youths, as they say in My Cousin Vinny, who work for the federal government. And so there isn't actually an official youth delegation for the United States, but we're such a big country that there are still plenty of youth from the United States. So we were able to be in spaces where it was primarily youth official delegates from each country, and we are not delegates from the United States, but we are the de facto delegates in the room from the United States, because there are no official U.S. delegates. So that was really cool, getting to quasi-represent like America's youth in that way.
That's nicely put. Yes, Sancia.
I would also add that as far as I think U.S. delegates went, the university delegations that we interacted with, I feel we definitely were on the younger end of those, because I feel like a lot of universities sent delegations that primarily comprised of like faculty members and grad students, whereas like BC really tries to emphasize sending both undergraduate and grad students. I mean, we met a couple undergrad students from, I think, Vanderbilt, but I think those were the only undergraduate students from the United States that I actually interacted with. So definitely take this opportunity and like run with it, because it's very, very hard to find. And I think we're very lucky to be here and have access to that.
Great. Thanks, Sancia. Yes.
I'm wondering if you can share any reflections on how your experience at COP was affected by being specifically in Dubai. So any elements related to how UAE hosting it affected how things went, or your experience like being in Dubai and then going to COP, and I don't know, any interesting comparisons between the broader environment or culture and the conversations at COP.
I have stuff to say.
I
Yeah. So I will start by saying that I think the UAE did an excellent job hosting COP28. I have friends who are at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I heard a lot of horror stories about there being no food, getting food poisoning, just lots of school buses. Like, they did a very good job managing it. You can tell that they're a country that deals with these sorts of large events. With that being said, it was Katie mentioned the environment. Most days that week 2 was there, we were under an air quality red alert, which is kind of ironic. If you look at this poster later, there's a photo I took of just the smog just blocking out the sky, which it's a little ironic that we're at a climate conference and it's primarily outdoors and walking a lot, and it's getting the alerts from the EPA like, hey, you shouldn't be outside, or so that's something that was on the mind always about being in a petro state. But also the overarching politics of the UAE, I was constantly thinking about. They tout how friendly they are to women and minorities. They've got a great gender pavilion, which was amazing, and they tout how they've got the world's only female majority parliament, until you realize that the parliament is really just a sham, and doesn't have any power, it's unelected. Me as someone who's queer, I had to think about going to a country where it's illegal to be queer, and had to make sure I left my pride collection at home, because who knows what would happen as a result. So the fact that it was in Dubai, I think, was always in the back of my head. from the environment to the politics. So overall, it was an amazing experience, but it also made it a kind of surreal experience for me, at least.
I think also, and I think you were kind of referring to this a little bit, the UAE being such a huge oil state and hosting a huge climate conference like the COP, where there might be like a little conflict of interest. I remember the first few days that we were there were rumors that there were side deals happening, and that the UAE was kind of using COP as a platform to establish those connections with, say, other fossil fuel companies. I think we also attended some very interesting events with the COP28 president, who was also simultaneously one of the co-owners of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And so that was very interesting because we consistently hear him say things like, we're going to do our best, we're going to do whatever it takes, whatever the science is telling us. But for him, the side point was that the science was saying that it wasn't necessary to completely eliminate fossil fuels. So that was like an interesting balance that we were seeing when we were attending events where, representatives from the UAE were talking, and just like the general atmosphere, like that was definitely something that was on delegates' minds, and definitely on ours.
Yeah.
Gabby, go ahead.
I would just like to echo that. I completely agree. I think that there were a lot of mistakenly made contradictory statements by representatives of the UAE delegation who were, talking about doing everything that we can to phase down fossil fuels or phase out fossil fuels, but then also making pseudo climate denialist comments. So it was definitely a conflict of interest in a lot of ways that influenced, I think, to a great extent, the authority and just the respect that people kind of had for the host country. But I think that overall they did a good job handling it, and we did see some groundbreaking, amazing outcomes.
Right. Jack, to you.
I would echo all that. I would say that going into the week, I definitely had tempered expectations, just knowing that the host country does play a really large role in the final draft. And so I think that knowing that it was a petro state and going into the UAE, obviously a petro state hosting a international climate conference is a little bit contradictory. But also I was hopeful because petro states and these very oil dominant states are the ones that we need to be addressing this issue. So I think that in some ways I have lots of optimism going in that at least it is being hosted at a state that has a significant stake here. But I think that the final draft, which I'm sure that you can see the exhibit later, the final draft was a little bit in the middle. I mean, there was definitely some room for optimism, but also not nearly as much as we were hoping.
Thanks, Jack. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, go ahead.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, was there any sort of quality control on baseline scientific literacy? Like, when you had these roundtable discussions, was there any kind of intro of, here's what we know from the IPCC, or I guess like how was that standardized so people weren't just coming with whatever they came up with that night?
I don't think it was standardized.
So to quickly answer to that question, every year when COP events that happen in November, late November, December, a few months before that COP event, IPCC comes out with a report. And that is considered to be the key report on the basis, that's the scientific report that IPCC comes out with, and that becomes the nodal report that is referenced for all the discussions and so on and so forth. But it's just that 2 weeks is too short of a time to again rediscuss each of those benchmarks and so on. That's why IPCC comes up with those reports a little earlier, and then we have the COP conferences and so on. Because the COP conference is all about the policies, negotiations, and discussions, and relatively less on the scientific discussions and so on and so forth. I think that to a certain extent answers the question. I think the last 2 minutes, and that is something that I thought that I will say for myself, for one key question. To all of you, how do you think that your experience and engagement at COP you're going to apply in immediate or long-term future?
So obviously COP28 is the largest global environmental law conference there is, so it's the premier event I think that going to this event, I had a lot of ideas of what it was like, and then obviously experiencing it in person and getting to interact with different individuals and key stakeholders really informed my view on everything, and then also has kind of led to me really wanting to pursue environmental law in the future and hopefully eventually become a negotiator at an event like this. So I think that's how I would say it informed it.
Thanks, Gabby.
That's good. I mean, not only did I absorb like an immense amount of information throughout the entire thing, but having the opportunity to sit in on both the high level and the smaller level knowledge sharing events really kind of reinforced my belief that the grassroots implementation and adaptation and policymaking is what's most important. So I do plan to work in grassroots organizing and environmental and nonprofit work in my future. And I think that getting to interact with the leaders on that forefront was really inspiring and affirming that that's what I want to do with my life.
So I mentioned earlier that I'm on the pre-med track and I want to go into healthcare. I think one thing that I've kind of like climate change has been something that I've been passionate about for a very long time, but something I've been struggling to kind of figure out is how do I want to incorporate it into my future career professional, or do I want to just like keep advocating for it from like a more personal standpoint, from a more interest standpoint. And I think it was really interesting going to COP and interacting with so many different medical practitioners who were occupying these spaces, who were leading conversations. And I think that's something I am so much more sure that that's something I want to do now. I've been looking into seeing how different medical schools are now incorporating climate change into their curriculums, which is very interesting. I definitely know that I want to work in that space, so I will probably end up getting a master's in public health along with my MD, so I can work in both spheres. And I really hope that I get to go back and be a part of COP and work in climate advocacy as a medical practitioner in the future. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
So I've known I wanted to go into environmental law for as long as I can remember. I'm from Long Island, New York originally, and I can remember when Hurricane Sandy hit 100,000 homes and destroyed them. And it was then and there that I knew that environmental policy and law was the path I wanted to go into. I've also kind of given up hope on the federal government's ability to take action on this. If you look at the United States Congress, you can understand why. And so for the past few years, I've been really passionate about the impact that regional governments can make. Right here in Massachusetts, for instance, we have an amazing climate law. New York State is on the cusp of passing the nation's first cap and invest law. And regional compacts like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative can be really effective ways to counter a federal government that's unable to act. I was also afraid, though, going into COP, that the international community would be very much like the American federal government in that it's unable to make progress in any way. And so I went in fully hoping to just learn about how regional governments can make a difference on climate change. But I was genuinely pleasantly surprised about the outcome. Jack said the agreement in COP28 was not what we were looking for. Of course not. But it was progress, and I was not expecting that progress to come from the United Arab Emirates hosting. So I was very impressed, and I'm leaving it more impassioned about going into environmental law, which is the field I'll be going into, but also hopeful that I can do work beyond just the regional level, but also on an international level too.
Great, thanks Eddie. This is exactly and absolutely what, as a faculty, I would really want to see. These kinds of engagements and experiences are really strengthening your future commitments and future ambitions, and that's, I think, it's one of the greatest utilities of attending these international meets. So thanks so much for your time, and thank you all so much for the questions. We have a few exhibits, so please, if you have a few more questions unanswered, then all our delegates are going to be over here in one of those exhibits. Please feel free to pose more questions, engage with these exhibits. They're quite interesting. And these are the short-term activities. And if you're students, faculties, please be on the lookout for the request for application for the next year of engagement and visit. And by extension, I'm sure I would really like to thank Schiller Institute and by extension Boston College to have provided all of us with this opportunity to attend COP28. Thank you. Thank you so much.